In today's video, we're discussing a lot of information from Friedman's latest 31 Thoughts blog, where we get a lot of trade and free agent rumors to discuss. We also have some updates from the NHL getting sponsors for each of its new divisions for the 2021 season. The Seattle Kraken have added to their front office, and we have some updates on the Canucks and some potential roster moves. We'll discuss all that coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we have a variety of things to talk about today. A lot of today's information comes from Friedman's latest 31 Thoughts blog. But before we jump into those details, let's hit on a few other quick tidbits of information here. First up, Colin Wilson, longtime NHL player, most recently with the Colorado Avalanche, has announced his retirement from the NHL after 11 seasons, over 600 games played. Certainly pretty solid career overall. Played with the Predators for a long time before joining the Colorado Avalanche. So he's decided not to continue playing and not sign any other contracts. Obviously, he was a free agent this year. This wasn't really a player that I thought would retire at this point, but he's decided to move on from the game, so best of luck to him. We did get information that the Seattle Kraken are adding to their front office. Ron Francis, the general manager, has hired former Sabres general manager and former assistant GM with the Penguins, Jason Botterill, as an assistant general manager. Of course, he was a well-respected assistant GM when he was with the Penguins. He was looked upon as somebody who would be a future GM. Went to Buffalo on that opportunity when it came up, and things didn't really work out overly well. He was there for a couple of years. The Sabres didn't really see any progression, and then the Pagulas decided to move on from him and make the change there not that long ago, obviously hiring Kevin Adams. So he's back to being an assistant GM with Seattle. So obviously, with Botterill's past, I would think that might be a better fit for him, a good role. He's still kind of viewed upon as being a well-respected hockey man in the NHL, so we'll see what he can do with the Kraken. They've also added Norm McIver as well as the director of player personnel. So certainly McIver's a guy with a long time NHL experience, both as a player and as an executive. So some good people added to the Kraken organization there. I would imagine over time, since we're getting a little closer to Seattle making their debut, that we will get more and more information throughout this season on different people that are looking to add to their front office. And we'll be getting closer to them naming the first ever franchise head coach, which I assume will likely come later into the year, once we get probably through the 2021 NHL season, once coaches start becoming available. After the season, the teams that didn't do well and meet expectations, there's bound to be at least a few that are let go either throughout or at the end of the year. So I would assume that Francis will probably wait, see what becomes available there, plus what's available now, and kind of make a decision as we approach maybe into the summertime, as that would give them enough time to prepare for next year. Obviously, the head coach wouldn't be quite as involved as the management team when it comes to scouting and getting ready for the expansion draft and all that stuff for putting the original roster together, but certainly somebody they'll want to get some input from. Now, as I mentioned as well, the NHL has come up with another way to generate some revenue. All of their newly made divisions for the 2021 season will have sponsors. So they're all sponsored by a different company. For example, I'll show you a graphic here that the NHL put out earlier. The Canadian or the North Division will be sponsored by Scotiabank, so it's going to be called the Scotia North Division. We have the Honda West Division. Of course, Honda's done a lot of sponsorships with the Western teams, especially in California. The Honda Center there in Anaheim. So obviously, the long history there. You also have the Discover Central Division, and then you also have the Mass Mutual Eastern Division. Obviously, that's another way for the NHL to generate revenue. We've seen them come out earlier with the helmet ads, which a lot of teams have announced some kind of a partnership so far. I don't think they all have at this point, but by the time the season gets underway, I would think we'll see all teams with helmet ads. Now it's not really a big deal in my opinion. At this point, they need to do whatever they can to generate extra money to make up for the shortfall and a lot of the revenues that they lost. If the NHL has to go the entire season without putting fans in attendance, then a lot of teams are obviously not going to make money this year. Obviously, without that gate revenue, that's a big part of the puzzle here. So that's going to be an issue. They need to find other ways to be creative to try to stay afloat and cut their losses so it's not quite so much. So I would imagine as time goes on, we'll see more and more creative ways as well for the NHL to sell some kind of sponsorships to create some extra money. As I mentioned as well, we had an update on the Vancouver Canucks and obviously their roster situation. They're getting to the point now where training camps are well underway. The season is just over a week away, so we're going to start seeing teams start to make decisions on their rosters. Players are going to be going through waivers a little bit. They're going to taxi squad for those who require it. Obviously, there's going to be some players that are going to be cut and sent to the AHL teams as well. Obviously, we know the AHL now is going to have a season. We announced yesterday there's going to be a few teams that are not going to be participating, but all of those teams do have an arrangement for their players and their prospects to go play with another NHL team's prospects in the AHL. So they've all got a place for their players to go. They may not be able to send quite as many as they normally would, but at least it's something. So obviously there's that. Now when it comes to the Canucks, there's been some talk about Loui Eriksson. Apparently he hasn't really looked the greatest in training camp. I know based on video footage that's been shared by reporters that have been at the rink, it looks as though he's certainly lost a step, which is not a huge shocker. He hasn't really performed up to par since he's had that contract in Vancouver, but even for his skating ability and the fact that he's been a relatively decent penalty killer and things like that, a player that Travis Green could put out there and trust in defensive situations and killing penalties, might not even be a situation where they really feel they can even rely on that anymore. So obviously having him in the minors would certainly be helpful from a cap perspective because they can't get his whole contract buried, but at least they'll get a little bit over $1 million salary cap relief by having him there. But there's some word, though, from Vancouver media that he might not even be a player that they put on the taxi squad. So if they wanted to put Loui on the taxi squad, he would still go through waivers, assuming he doesn't get claimed, which you would know he likely wouldn't. He'd go on the taxi squad, so he'd stay with the NHL team, but then he would obviously still count as an AHL player when it comes to the salary cap. So they'd get the relief of the $1 million plus and kind of go from there. But there's belief now that he may not even be a player they want to keep in that situation. They might want to give that to obviously other younger, more promising players, and then he might actually be relegated to go down and play with the AHL team in Utica instead, which would obviously probably be a little bit of a blow to his ego. Obviously, longtime NHL player. Shouldn't be too shocked, though. He knows that things haven't worked out the best for him during his time with the Vancouver Canucks, but obviously, that could kind of cause some issues potentially. I mean, some veterans don't take well to being sent down. There was some talk that maybe after spending a year in the minors, but maybe next year he might not want to even participate, and maybe he just might hang him up and retire. I don't know if the Canucks would get that lucky. At the end of the day, I'm sure Loui Eriksson would rather get paid and deal with whatever he has to in order to get that money. I can't imagine him just walking away and making things that simple on Vancouver. But I would think, as I mentioned before, when I get to that final year, there's a much more likelihood of a buyout, and it's a lot more feasible. And if that doesn't happen, then trading him with some salary retained or something would be a lot easier as well. So I would think that this will be his last year in Vancouver one way or another. But it could be a real situation that not only does he go to the taxi squad, but he actually goes down to the AHL and plays, and they reserve that spot for an up-and-coming player. I mean, they're likely going to carry anywhere from 4 to 6 players on that squad, including one extra goaltender. They need to have 3 goalies on hand. Loui might not be in their plan, so we'll see how things go. But at the end of the day, here won't be too long, I don't think, before he goes through waivers and gets demoted. Now, based on Elliotte Friedman's latest 31 Thoughts blog, there were certainly some interesting nuggets in there that I wanted to talk about here today. Certainly some points for discussion. Some of these guys we've been talking about in the last few days, and just some more information, including guys like Dubois, Laine, and Barzal, like you saw in the thumbnail, which we talked a lot about yesterday as well. A couple other free agent notes that he made in the blog that I found interesting, just wanted to touch on quickly. Obviously, when it comes to some of these free agents that have signed with different teams, there certainly were some other teams in the mix, including Mike Hoffman. Apparently the Montreal Canadiens were really, really interested in Hoffman. They were really hoping to add him. Obviously, they kind of ran out of room, though. They were trying to figure out ways to not only add Toffoli and Josh Anderson that they brought in through trade, but they really wanted to bring in Hoffman as well. So obviously, Bergevin is being extremely aggressive, as we've talked about. Not a huge shocker. I think after last year, in the progress they saw in the bubble in the playoffs, that he kind of looked upon this as a year that they absolutely have to make the playoffs, because based on the traditional format, the Habs wouldn't have made it last year, but because of everything in the expanded format they did, got some valuable experience that they didn't think they were going to get, and kind of surprised not only the other teams, but I think they might have surprised themselves as well. Saw some good progression, and now the pressure is on to make the playoffs, and if they don't, there's going to be more pressure, I think, on Bergevin and things to kind of change things up And, I wouldn't think his job is really in jeopardy or anything like that. But at the same time, I'm sure GMs do feel pressure from ownership to make the playoffs. That's where they make a lot of their extra money. So they were in on Hoffman, just could not make it work money-wise. If they would have been able to make some other moves that they were apparently working on, then it could have come to be. They could have been even stronger up front. Now, the Ottawa Senators were also another team that were in on Tyler Toffoli, who was, obviously signed in Montreal. Obviously, Toffoli's a guy they were pretty keen on or pushing to sign. That was obviously not to be, because Toffoli obviously saw a better opportunity in Montreal with a team that's further along and where it's at as far as contending, being a winner. The Habs are a team that made the playoffs last year, surprised, as I just said. So clearly he's seen that as a more of a winning chance, at least in the short term, than it would be in Ottawa, which makes sense. But as we know, the Senators have added a fair bit of veterans. Their goal here is they really want to be a really tough team to play against. They want to improve. They wanted to add some veterans and bring in some good leadership and have some good mentors for their younger guys. So they've done that. They got a veteran goaltender, Matt Murray. They traded for Derek Stepan. They signed some other players as well, like Dodonov, Galchenyuk, obviously brought in Austin Watson. So there's a lots of guys there that can work on that, and they wanted to bring in Toffoli as well. I don't know if they would have brought in Toffoli, they likely would have not made another move. Maybe Dodonov wouldn't have been signed. I don't know which one, because it wasn't clear exactly when those talks were happening. But the Sens were in play when it comes to Tyler Toffoli, and it's a player that they really were hoping to get under contract. Now, Friedman goes on to talk about the Patrik Laine situation. Obviously, talks about his media availability that we touched on yesterday, and the fact that he really didn't look overly pleased, kind of awkward, which really no big surprise in that regard. He does go on to mention, though, that obviously at this point, he's not sure if that relationship, like the one with Dubois and Columbus, will ever really be mended, and that maybe it's a matter of time before he is traded. He goes on to talk about the team like the Jackets, though, that are a team that were inquiring on Laine's services even before they were kind of more publicly known, at least, about the Dubois situation. So you can't help but wonder, as I talked about yesterday, if Dubois and Laine could be a really solid trade opportunity for those two teams to get together. We know that they don't usually like to trade with division rivals or anything like that, so they play in separate conferences, different divisions. So from that perspective, I think these two teams can help each other out. I think it would have to be a bigger deal, not a one-for-one type of thing. But personally, if the Jackets are been rumored to be showing interest in Laine for a long time, and the Jets were interested in Dubois, there's got to be more to that. Now, the other team that he mentions as well is still being interested in Laine and has continuously inquired was the Philadelphia Flyers. I think the Flyers are going to be a team as well that will be a player for Laine services if and when the Winnipeg Jets decide to pull the trigger here. I think that the Flyers would have a lot of great pieces to offer a really significant trade for them as well. So I can see there being interest in that regard. Now, one other thing he mentioned in the blog as well to kind of mention it as maybe as a potential conspiracy is a kind of a joke, but still one thing that I wasn't aware of, at least, and many of you may not have been as well, is that Pierre Luc Dubois' dad actually works for the Winnipeg Jets. He works for them as an assistant coach with their American Hockey League team with the Manitoba Moose. There's all those talk about maybe Dubois going to Winnipeg, and Dubois for Laine trade might solve both their team's issues. And I did not realize that Dubois' dad actually worked for the Winnipeg Jets. So maybe this bigger stage he's looking for, as we mentioned, doesn't necessarily have to be the biggest markets. I mean, some players just prefer to, we're talking more about just the hockey environment. Like, what's the fan base like? What's the arena like? What's the game environment like? Obviously players like in Vegas, for example, Vegas is not the biggest market, but they've really, embraced the game of hockey, and that arena is pretty crazy when it's full of fans, and they've really done well in that regard. Winnipeg, at the same time, since they've returned and moved from Atlanta, like that building's always full. It's a crazy fan base. They really support that team hardcore, so it is a great market in that sense. And I've seen some other reports saying that when it comes to Dubois wanting a bigger stage, as has been put, it's not necessarily about going to the biggest markets when it comes to areas. So we're not necessarily talking like a New York or Toronto, Los Angeles, that type of thing. He's just looking for a bigger stage in a sense of more of what he would feel to be a better hockey market. So I think Winnipeg would qualify in that regard, and if his dad's working there, that's even more incentive. So maybe there's more to this or not. I mean, I know he was joking in the blog about a potential conspiracy point, but it makes a lot of sense for both teams. Like, do you not agree here that to see that they could even expand. You throw in guys like David Savard's been in the rumor mill, Jack Roslovic, and some others. Like, there could be a 2 or 3 player deal on each side, so maybe make it a 5-6 player trade. But it would make a lot of sense for both these teams to get together and see what happens. And when you're hearing from the top insiders that they kind of each have interest in each other's players, you have to think that there's a really, decent opportunity here that at some point they may get together and actually pull the trigger. So let me know what your thoughts are down below on a potential Laine and Dubois deal. Do you think maybe, with all the information we've learned here over the last few days, that maybe there is more to this and maybe it is something we might see after all? Now, lastly, here he goes on to talk about Barzal and the Islanders. As I talked on yesterday, clearly it's a situation where we feel like a deal might be getting close. A long-term deal is something that the Barzal camp really was pushing for and really wanted, but not something the Islanders can handle with the cap situation with the way it is. There's just no way they can commit that much money. So therefore, a short-term deal, a 3-year deal, probably in that $6 million range is likely what we're going to see. Maybe it's even a 2-year deal, but a 2 or 3 year deal is the most likely outcome for a Barzal contract. And given where everything's at with him being in the area, attending day 1 of camp for the physicals and all that, there's many believe that a deal is getting close. Now, the other part of the Barzal negotiations and the whole Islanders cap situation that was revealed today as well, it looks as though that the contract for Matt Martin that's kind of sitting waiting is actually a pretty surprising deal. It looks as though I've seen reports that it could be as much as 4 years and around $1.5 million, which is quite surprising. I thought it would be a 1-year deal at $700,000-800,000. I didn't think they would want to commit that long, but obviously it's a case that Friedman believes it's more of like a loyalty thing, that the Islanders are obviously appreciative of everything he's done for the franchise, been there a long time, outside of a quick time that he was gone for a while and then came back, and that they want to reward him with some tenure and some dollars. So we'll see. I mean, right now it's listed as Martin, Schneider, and Green all being in camp on PTOs. It's believed the contract for Green is somewhere around $1 million, maybe $900,000 to $1 million on a 1-year deal. So if you look at the Islanders cap situation, they have the Johnny Boychuk contract at $6 million. If that Barzal contract is pretty similar, they would offset the LTIR relief they can get for Boychuk would essentially go to Barzal, and the other $3.9, I think it is, million that they have available could satisfy the Martin contract, the Green contract, and still have some room. So they're probably going to, obviously with the timing of the LTIR usage, they'll do their best to time everything out so they can maximize what they can get out of it. But it looks as though they might not need to really do much of anything else for other moves. The Islanders could still maybe even squeeze in another cheap depth person as well, depending on what they want to do. But that Martin contract was quite surprising. I didn't really think they'd be getting any kind of term, especially that much money. So let me know your thoughts on that as well. Let me know your thoughts on everything discussed down below, and we'll discuss further down in the comment section. I highly recommend as well you all take the time to watch the World Junior Gold Medal game tonight between Canada and the USA. That should be one heck of a battle. We will be talking about the tournament and recapping the gold medal game tomorrow here on the channel, so stay tuned for that. Thank you very much for watching, everybody, and I'll catch you next time.